Hi, everyone. We are very fortunate to have our first lecture of the semester today, Friday, February 4th. We get to conclude our first 2 weeks of the semester in this way all together. First things first, our favorite formality. This presentation will be recorded on Zoom. If you do not wish to be recorded, please turn off your video camera. You can participate in the chat. You can participate by unmuting. You can raise your hand. You can do reactions, all these things, but we are going to be recording. So if you prefer not to be recorded, please navigate your Zoom appropriately. Next, I would like to just take a minute for a land acknowledgement before we get started. The University of Maryland is built on land that was stolen from the Piscataway people by European colonists. Subsequently, the land upon which campus is located is likely to have been worked by some of the over 300 enslaved African people who were the property of Charles Benedict Calvert, founder of Maryland Agricultural College, the predecessor to the present-day University of Maryland. So we pay respects to the Piscataway people and the enslaved African people whose lives were tied to these lands. We'll take a moment together to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, settlement that bring us here virtually, in this case, today. All right, thank you. So before we get started today, I just want to recap our events. We have our first lecture today. We're so lucky to have Emily, Williamson, Ibrahim. Then we have a panel on February 18th from different firms talking about how they're working through diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice in their practices. That will be moderated by your friend and mine, Marcus King, our faculty member, who many of you know through Studio, through the Key Professorship. On March 4th, the Art and Archaeology Department is hosting Mabel Wilson for a lecture, so we're hoping we can at least participate virtually in that. And then we will conclude our lecture series with Enrique de Anda from Mexico talking about architectural history. So that's the arc of the events today. And we are very grateful to the Guy Lombardo Lecture Fund for supporting ongoing learning through public programming in the architecture program. We come together to talk about ideas, to talk about architecture, to talk about space, to talk about place, storytelling, history in the future. And it's a really special and unique opportunity we have, and we couldn't do it without the support of funds like the Guy Lombardo Lecture Fund. And I'm going to hand it over to Julie Gabrielli to introduce Emily, and then we will pass the baton to Emily for the lecture. Julie, are you able to unmute?
Yes.
Great.
I got all these different screens going. Okay, thanks. Wow, I'm just very excited to be welcoming Emily here. Actually, Michelle Amprakos is the one who introduced me to her work last year or last fall or summer when we were figuring out who to invite for lectures. So I'm glad it finally worked out, although it's been lovely to welcome you here in person. We're lucky to have you join us tonight. Emily Williamson Ibrahim is a PhD candidate in anthropology at Boston University, and her current research is focusing on a cryptic form of communication called folded speech in Hausa that offer a lens through which to understand how people manage anxieties about living with uncertainty among Zongos, which is the name used to describe predominantly Muslim urban settlements in Ghana, West Africa. Emily holds a Master of Science in Architectural Studies from MIT and a Master of Architecture from my alma mater, University of Virginia. And she's also has an undergraduate degree in art history from Colby College. And Emily has worked as an architect in Washington, D.C., collaborating on cultural heritage projects in Ghana, Peru, and Haiti, and has taught at landscape architecture at the Rhode Island School of Design. And she's also a co-founder of the nonprofit organization called the Zongo Story Project, which has a website, zongostoryproject.com, which has a lot of cool stuff on it. And so in that project, she works with students in Ghana to write, illustrate, and tell stories that are meaningful to them. In 2016, her book, Gizo Gizo, A Tale from the Zongo Lagoon, won the African Studies Association's Africana Book Award for the best children's book. So I think you're getting a sense of the breadth of Emily's talent and interests. And so I can't wait to see what she's going to share with us about from her work tonight. So welcome, Emily.
Thanks, Julie. And I'm going to stop sharing and hand it over to you, Emily. And if we were in person, of course, there'd be a very warm welcome round of applause, but we're in Zoom, so it's crickets. But we're really glad to have you. Thank you for being here. And whenever you're ready, please feel free to screen share.
Okay, I will share my screen. Hopefully it will work. How is that for everyone?
Perfect, full screen.
And I always wonder about the chat box. Can you see a sort of a blank area of my screen where the chat box is overlapping? I know that sometimes that's been a problem in the past.
I can see your whole slide and no.
My whole screen. Okay, great. I do like to have the chat box up just in case there are clarification questions that come up. Okay, so now that we're done with the technology, thank you so much for having me. It's an absolute pleasure to be here this evening. In some ways, I feel like I'm coming home because I lived and worked in DC for a number of years. As Julie mentioned, I did go to the University of Virginia, so I'm very familiar with your part of the world and only wish I was there in person today. And then second, it's also just, I like to say this to architecture students and to when I give lectures in architecture programs, that it's just such a joy to speak with people who know and understand the material world and care deeply about it. And it's not something that is always understood in anthropology, surprisingly. So it's just an absolute gift to be able to share that with you today. And I'm really looking forward to hearing your thoughts and questions and curiosities as we explore sense of place and storytelling together. So without further ado, let me get started here. So a couple of quick things. So housekeeping items. One is that I'll try to speak for around 50 minutes or so we have plenty of time for questions at the end. Second is that I think I'll try to keep questions towards the end if that's okay, but if you do have clarifying questions, I'll try to keep an eye on the chat just in case. And if you forget a question, feel free to, or if you want to sort of save a question, feel free to put it in the chat and then I can wait till the end to answer it. And then lastly, just a quick note is I'm going to be covering a lot of territory. And it's very purposeful that sometimes I speed through things that could literally be a presentation or talk on their own, but it's because I want you to be able to kind of get a sense of the breadth of my work, but then go deeper in certain areas. So just so you're not kind of wondering if you missed something, if I just am jumping around quite quickly. Okay, so here we go. So my talk is called We Are All Ears, A Sense of Place and Storytelling in Ghana, West Africa. And I don't really need to even share this slide with architects, but I do like it if people have a pen and paper close at hand during my presentation. I remember when I used to attend lectures at the University of Virginia, I always had my sketchbook right on hand and was taking, madly taking notes during all of the lectures. But sometimes with anthropology students, I need to remind them. But if you do have a piece of paper, sometimes I find it helpful to jot down notes, or I'm going to be asking a series of questions, not as a test or anything, but just for you to kind of ruminate over. And so sometimes it's helpful to just kind of jot down ideas or sketch something as we go. Okay, so to give you a quick overview of where we're headed this evening, what I would like to start out with is a puzzle. And I often start my anthropology presentations in this way, but I find it quite helpful in general. So the big puzzle that I've been not struggling with, but that has continuously challenged me again and again is how, if at all, do we design in places that are unfamiliar to us? And so what I want to explore that tonight, and I'm going to propose sort of exploring this through both my own kind of transdisciplinary approach over kind of a number of projects over time, and then also to go a little bit deeper into one particular strategy that I've used that I keep finding sort of resurfacing in my different projects that has been very helpful for me, which is storytelling. And so I think it's going to be interesting for us to think about the ways in which design and storytelling and sense of place kind of continuously sort of interact with one another. Okay, so my own journey, this puzzle actually started when I first went to Ghana, West Africa the first time was, I believe, in 2002. So it's been a long time now. And ever since I've been going back and forth, and my puzzle has been trying to make sense of the two very, very different places that I spend most of my life in. So we have here cold New England. There, you can see how kind of quiet, serene, still this landscape is. I grew up in New Hampshire, in an area that actually looks quite a bit like this, not quite at this elevation. And then I would find myself oftentimes in a place like this. So I wish that we were all there in person right now so you could hear it, but it's loud, it's boisterous, there's tons of moving parts. All of the time people are, trying to kind of navigate their way across the streets. In addition to loud noises, there are also lots of strong smells. So you're constantly brushing up against different kinds of spices in the market. And, we're all sweating profusely. So you can just kind of get a sense of how different these two senses of place are and how they very much, if you think about whether you're living in one place or the other, that the way that you engage in the world is going to be quite different, just in terms of the way you physically navigate it, but then also the way in which you make moral judgments, the way your belief systems, all of that is going to be, of course, affected by the place in which you are living. So the puzzle is, how do we make sense of places that feel deeply unfamiliar? What kinds of dispositions and skills do we need? And specifically as designers, how do we go about our work in these places if we should at all? Okay, so Julie shared with me last week actually that a number of you I think this hopefully resonates with many of you, because I'm sure you often do studios that are not necessarily based in the United States or even if they are based in the United States, not based in an area that you know very well. So Spain, I think, where some of your studios are located there, maybe Iraq, and then also I think some of your thesis projects are perhaps in hometowns. So you get a range of places that may be less or more familiar to you. But then I show this image because this is actually a view from my window. So you're looking at, yes, dumpsters here from my apartment window. But so unfamiliar places also don't necessarily have to be physically far away. They can be very close to you. And over the last few years living here, I have noticed that there is an entire community that is built up around these dumpsters. And people are coming and going, and there's a schedule. And I wake up at 6 o'clock every morning to hear kind of the rattle of the shopping carts as people come in to collect the recycling. So anyway, there are many different worlds within, our own worlds too. So you don't necessarily have to go far. Many worlds in the United States, as we've all come to especially realize in the last few years. So what I would like you to do on your, sketch pad or whatever you have is think of a place that you're curious about or one that you want to get to know better. And this could be a place that you already think you know quite well, or it could be a place that you don't really know at all. It could be a place that you're getting to know, perhaps in your studio class. But then just write down 1 to 2 questions that you might have about it. And again, this is not something that you need to share. If you would like, feel free to put your place in the chat or your question, so we can see what one another are thinking about. I'm sure the easiest one to imagine here would probably, be your studio. Let's give you a minute to think about that. And then as we go, I'm going to be talking about a specific place that I have come to know much better, but that in many ways is still very unfamiliar to me. But as I do that, I often think it's helpful for you as audience members to not only be thinking about the place that I'm looking at, but thinking about it in relation to a place that is meaningful or could be meaningful to you. So you can be thinking about it through your own lens. So it's helpful for your own work as well as hearing about mine. Okay, so I'm going to keep going. Feel free to continue thinking about this. Drawing undrifts from the first. Yes, absolutely. She was my thesis advisor, and I think you will see that Rob Endrips's vibe kind of continues to live on through this entire talk. So she's very inspirational to me. Okay, great. So the place that I have come to know is West Africa, but much more specifically Ghana, West Africa. And even more specifically than that is a particular kind of settlement that is throughout West Africa, but has become particularly important in both in history and in contemporary Ghana. And these are called Zongos, or stranger settlements, or sometimes they're called stopovers in the language of Hausa. And so these are places where people are constantly coming and going. Most of them are Muslims, at least in Ghana, but they're considered strangers. So they've often lived on the margins of society and don't necessarily have historically the same kinds of rights and privileges that other people living in Ghana have had. But then because they've lived on the margins, they also have access to distant territories, distant ideas, objects that they can bring to Ghana. And so in some ways, at the same time they're marginalized, they also have kind of, been seen to have kind of particular magical or kind of special powers. So I've long been interested in this kind of tense, but really generative relationship between Zongos and the context of which they are part. And it's raised a number of different kinds of questions and curiosities for me over the years that as I'll get into each of those in turn. But then this is, you can see the Zongo, or one of the Zongos in Ghana. And again, it's a type of settlement. So there are a number of there's a Zongo, at least one, oftentimes up to 3 in every major urban center in Ghana. Okay, so I want to start with a transdisciplinary approach, sensing place, making sense of place. So in this section, I want to ask, what is a sense of place? How might gaining a deeper sense of place offer us new and more expansive ways of thinking about the design process? So for me, sensing place has everything to do with kind of gaining an attachment to a place over a long period of time, really taking your time, slowing down, and it's not moving on a place or through a place, it's becoming part of a place. And I think that this image here really gets at least how I understand sense of place, is this complete relationship between, you essentially kind of become the place. But of course, that gets very complicated in a place like in Zongos, and in reality, when we're all constantly moving through places. And so, you can see how complex that navigation becomes. And I think, but Keith Basso also writes about senses of place. And I think I love his quote here. He's an anthropologist, and he writes, "Places we realize are as much a part of us as we are part of them, and senses of place, yours, mine, and everyone else's, partake complexly of both." So what I would like to do is just explore through 3 different kinds of questions how I have come to gain a sense of place, at least to some extent. I still have a lot of work to go of Zongos through different perspectives, through different kind of disciplinary lenses. So when I first arrived in the Zongo, it was the Cape Coast Zongo, which is maybe the 4th or 5th largest city in Ghana. And this is what I saw. So at the time I was at UVA, I was an architecture student, and immediately I was looking at, you know, the inequity between something like this and its context, which looks something like this. And so, I mean, I was very focused on the material sense of the world, but then I also started realizing how the surrounding context was predominantly Christian. Obviously, it looks, at least even just from looking at it, you know, much more well off than an area like this, which is the Zongo, and how clearly erosion is a problem, water infrastructure, just, I mean, the houses they seem to be falling apart. So for me at this moment in time, it raised all kinds of questions about what, as a designer, what do you do, right? And how do you engage, especially being someone not from there, not understanding the culture, not understanding all of the complexities of what's going on the ground. How do you, if you do it all, engage in this kind of conversation? And how do you, if you do it all, make any change? And so this is just showing how my pathway to figure this out was anything from straight, anything from one sort of mode of working or thinking, but rather, you know, constantly caused me to take detours, fall off the path, get back on it again, try a different path. So my early questions were, how do I create a long-term community-based plan for improving the Zongo's water infrastructure and public life? How might I consider not only material and spatial concerns, but also the larger environmental, social, and economic forces at play? So when I was in architecture school, I think a lot of my classmates thought I was a little bit crazy and that I was trying to do way too much, and I wasn't just going to do a building for my thesis project, but I was really emphatic about exploring these processes and almost designing a process more so than I was thinking about the actual product, because I wanted the product to be something that the community would end up being the ones who would actually do the design work. But what I ended up designing was a series of flexible parts that could be inserted over time, depending upon that were flexible, that could be kind of more or less permanent, depending upon what the community wanted, kind of much more experimental. I tried to take into account as much as I could at these early stages, social economic issues, trying to understand how the water actually flowed through this place and how people culturally, right, this is a predominantly Muslim society, so how they understood and used water throughout their everyday lives, and then seasonally, and then also annually. And then I actually, after I graduated, I went back for 3 consecutive years and undertook 3 phases of this project, where I actually presented my work to the community and took on all kinds of projects that were far over my head of, you know, creating conducting business workshops. We learned to make soap together. We built water infrastructure systems, water collection tanks, all kinds of stuff. And a lot of it was little because we didn't have a lot of money. And a lot of it was invisible because we didn't have a lot of money. But it really, at least I hope and believe that it had some kind of impact. But again, I think more than anything else, it made me realize how incredibly difficult this is and how little I knew. And the more time I spent there, the more I realized how little I knew, and that I needed to know more if I was going to be doing any kind of designing in this place. And at the same time as that project was going on, I was also engaged in some preservation work, so Asante traditional buildings, and talking with community members. This was not part of a Zongo, actually. This is a different community, but about the preservation of these shrines and thinking about the extent to which, and or if at all, similar kinds of questions, whether these shrines should be preserved if the community doesn't even want them to be preserved, if they hold no value for the community anymore, but they hold value for global global nonprofits. How do you kind of manage that? And it was very tricky, very fascinating. Again, made me realize how little I knew, and constantly I questioned, to what extent should I actually, how can I actually make a difference here? And then another project was storytelling. So I started working with students on thinking through their own experiences about water in their community and what kinds of challenges they faced, how they perceived water, what they used water for, what it meant to them. So then I moved into kind of a second stage of questions. This was essentially when I was at MIT. And the questions at this point that really interested me were things like, what combination of historical factors caused Zongos in Ghana to become socio-spatially marginalized? How did Zongos evolve over time? Who had a voice in these changes, and when did they have a voice? So here I became much more interested in the kind of historical implications, and a lot of it was also sort of a reaction to the sense that a lot of people saw these Zongos as static entities, as settlements that didn't have any history, that were something, are something, and will always be essentially the same thing. And so I was really pushing back against that, and also just wanting to understand, I mean, if we're going to design, right, then we're in the present tense, then to understand the proposed trajectory, you need to also understand what has already happened. Or the multiple trajectories, I should say, that it could take. So these are just a few images of my thesis. So you can just kind of get a sense of here, rather than just looking at one Zongo, the Cape Coast Zongo, I really was looking at the sociospatial processes of marginalization of all of the Zongos in Ghana. And I traveled a historic trade route, actually, which I will show in the next slide here, all the way from the oldest Zongo all the way up to, I was planning to go to Timbuktu, but it was a little too dangerous at the time. So I just made it to Burkina Faso. But I traveled this historic trade route to understand how the environment also contributed to, or didn't, or to what extent, and how the marginalization of these Zongos. So I was both kind of expanding spatially and looking at many different Zongos in relationship to one another to understand their contingency, but then also, again, going kind of deep into the colonial or pre-colonial histories to understand what these places are about. And then in addition, there were voices, plenty of voices that were missing from this history. So I spent a lot of time in the archives and was frustrated that rarely did I ever hear voices of Zongo community members were not included. And so I made it a point to spend a lot of time going from one Zongo to another and getting to know the people there. And at this point, asking more kind of interview-based questions. And at this point, I did not know Hausa, so I was also speaking in English, which was a challenge, but I did the best I could and integrated their own memories or the history, their own kind of passed down stories from generations about the history of this place. Okay, and so more recent questions, which Julie beautifully outlined actually in the beginning of this talk, is so how do the inhabitants of the Zongo experience the place in which they live? What does this place mean to them? How might their moral imaginations reflect their sense of place? So I think perhaps in part because I became fluent in their language, which is Hausa, it opened up multiple other worlds for me to understand, through which to understand this place. So even just knowing the language, I started hearing all kinds of things about what this place means to people and how they themselves see the Zongo as a collective entity, but then also as one that's incredibly diverse, which really struck me. So Nima, for instance, is the whole world in one place. Nima is the name of one of these Zongos. You can't just stick to one thing here. You can do whatever you want. You just have to do the right thing. We are all strangers here. So I became fascinated in this idea that this place, me getting to know this sense of place, is just so incredibly diverse. So how do people live with one another when they clearly have so many different values, beliefs, languages, different kinds of activities and practices that they're engaged in? How do they make sense of one another? And how do they live together in that kind of uncertainty? So my dissertation is looking at this in detail. I could give a number of different talks on this, but it's not my focus for today. But I become really interested in the ways in which people use something called folded speech, which is a cryptic category of communication, to handle this kind of uncertainty of not being able to know the other or seeing basically everyone around you as a stranger, including yourself. And then I also started looking at meaning through the lens of drawing. And so sometimes when I was over there, I would draw. Oftentimes it was very difficult because, again, it was hot and it was sticky, and the last thing I wanted to do was stand in the sun and draw for hours. But I would often sketch something, and then I would come back and fill it in with more detail. And then other times I've actually used drawing as a way to slow down and to almost re-enter the place through by being far away from it. So these were actually drawings that I did here in the United States based on drawing kind of sketches that I had done over there. And you start becoming attuned to the place in a way in which you don't, even when you're there, because you're so focused on maybe not tripping or who you're communicating with, that when you're actually able to kind of come back and reflect on it and add in more details from your memory, you can see, for instance, how people are, the way they order their clothing on a clothesline reflects larger ideas, for instance, about gender, about modernity, about tradition. So all of these little things, and getting a sense of what places mean to people just by drawing and paying attention and slowing down. And then I've also, during this process, I've also been doing a lot of diagramming. And so there's the experience of place as you literally see it and feel it. And then there's the kind of boundary making that goes on too. And so the separating and crossing and making and remaking of new boundaries as people's perceptions and ideas about themselves and others change. And so I found it helpful to also, I have more images on my website, but this kind of gives you a sense of the ways in which I've been trying to kind of picture different theories too, and how they map onto, or don't at all map onto, the places in which I work. And then I've also been drawn to children's drawings, and through my workshops, my storytelling workshops, looked at how people, how students understand their own sense of place and how much insight they can offer me towards understanding what these places are about. So this is My World by one of my students named Blessing. And you can just already get a sense of, hierarchies and what's important to this child. Okay, so now I want to move into the last section of my talk, which is focused on a strategy of storytelling. And the question that I ask here is, how might the strategy of storytelling help us gain a deeper sense of place and offer other entry points into the design process? And as I think you probably saw throughout my earlier questions, storytelling was kind of a thread, right, that moved throughout my work. And I found it to be somehow particularly resonant for me and the students with whom I worked, but even, and really anyone, men, women, young, old, it was something that we were all drawn to and that we could all connect with. But then at the same time was very personal. And so it was just this incredible tool. So I'm looking forward to sharing you both a little bit about this book that I worked with students in Cape Coast, Ghana, in that Zongo that I showed you earlier to produce. But then also kind of what came out of it, the sort of the larger process and sort of mode of going about and thinking about storytelling, and how I use that to gain a deeper sense of place. Okay, so I'm going to see if this works, but the story starts off with students where the storyteller says, Gatanan ku, meaning I am about to begin, and then the children respond, Tazo mujita, we are all ears, hence the title of my talk. So I'm going to try to play this for you though, of the students. We'll see if it works. Responding to the teacher. He's saying, say it louder. Okay, so I hope that can at least transport you there a little bit. So that's how these stories open. So you can just sense the excitement, right? Okay, so I'm not going to read you the whole story, but I always think it's helpful to read a little bit of it just so you can kind of get a sense of it makes the process that I'll be talking about a little bit easier to understand afterwards. Not so very long ago, many animals lived in the Zongo Lagoon. Fish basked in the clear, clean waters, frogs sang in the tall green grasses, lizards scurried up and down the trunks of leafy moringa trees. And down by the watery edge of the peaceful lagoon that flowed into the sea lived three best friends, crab, tortoise, and spider. Oops. It's frozen. Shoot. Seems frozen.
It is a little pixelated at the bottom. Maybe unscreen share and try again.
Okay, so sorry, everyone.
Minor glitch in the scheme of things.
I'm just trying to keep the suspense going, really. Okay, let's see.
We're on the edge of our seats for sure.
Okay, shoot. Okay. Oh, it's still, it's not wanting to do this. Okay, I'm gonna try one other thing and I know it will work.
Yeah, take your time.
I don't know about you guys, but I'm loving these illustrations.
Yeah, when you started talking about how drawing helps you to slow down, I thought, I hope my students are listening because we've been talking about that all week.
So it looks like my computer actually just froze. I don't think it liked that audio clip. Okay, so now I'm going to try this again. So sorry, y'all.
I think the audio clip was worth it.
Yeah,
okay, good.
that it was.
We also are doing hand drawings in 402.
Okay.
It'll be 3 weeks of hand drawing. So I think, Julie, to your point, it's a good reminder of why we do what we do.
Okay, I'm gonna just fast forward. And because of time, I'm not going to do the full screen again because I'm also worried it might get us back to the same problem.
Okay,
if this is okay.
Yeah, it's nearly just as large. It's
okay.
You can see everything.
Okay, well, with all of that suspense, let us continue the story. A fisherman by trade, Crab was generous and hardworking. He spent most of his time at the bottom of the lagoon with his family or hauling fish into his canoe. Tortoise was wise and patient. Animals came to him for advice and to buy the medicines he made from healing roots and leaves. Despite their differences, crab, tortoise, and spider ate dinner together every day at high tide. Crab caught the fish, tortoise blessed the kenke, and spider ate greedily. Unlike the other two, Spider was lazy and selfish. When he wasn't lounging around in his favorite moringa tree overlooking the lagoon, he mined for gold upstream and dreamt of being rich. One day after dinner, instead of throwing his rubbish in the dustbin, Spider tossed his kenke leaves and plantain peels right into the lagoon. "Aboki," Crab pleaded, using the Hausa name for friend. "You must respect the lagoon. It belongs to all of us." "Bah," Spider balked. "A little rubbish is no big deal. I own a mining business. Someday when I am rich, I am going to buy this place. I can do whatever I want." Okay, so the suspense continues because that's all I'm going to share today. But you can kind of get a sense of where that story is headed. And I actually ended up seeing this quote much later on, but I think it gets at the heart of a lot of what storytelling means to me. And it's by Ben Oakley, who's a Nigerian novelist. I don't know if any of you know his work, but it's fantastic. And I would really recommend you checking it out. But he says, "There is nothing that expresses the roundness of human beings more than storytelling. Stories are the highest technology of being." And so, I mean, even just from this little clip of the story that I shared, you can get a sense of how the story encapsulates a whole life or a whole world inside of it, right? And it's not necessarily your world, but it's one that you can identify with. And one that you can easily kind of imagine yourself there. So there's something about storytelling that is immensely kind of personal and private, but then also and very much sort of shared. And again, kind of has this roundness to it. So I've been thinking a lot about this roundness, both in terms of the roundness of the process itself. So what I call the name of our nonprofit is the Zongo Story Project, and we have this roundness of the process. So the fact that it encourages critical thinking and creativity through play, that it promotes local knowledge building of a sense of place and a sense of self, and elevates oral, written, and visual forms of literacy, which I believe now is called inclusive literacy. And so I'm going to kind of show how this roundness of the process sort of plays out in Ghana. And then there's also, in addition to that, there's the kind of something about the roundness of the content that I have often used the metaphor of soup, which works well in Ghana because there are tons of delicious soups and stews, as you can see here. And so we call it the story soup of what goes in your soup. So there might be objects, there's usually definitely some kind of a problem or issue or challenge. Places, there's characters, there's lessons, but then there's also other things that go into story soups, right? That we might each throw in the secret ingredients, the special spice, the whatever it is that is your own making. And so to explore this in more detail, let's fly to Ghana, and we're landing in Accra. And then we're traveling to Cape Coast. So again, this is to sort of show you, these are drawings by my students, by the way. I traced them over to make them a little bit clearer, but so you can get a sense of how they picture some of these transportation vehicles. So this one is called a trotro. And here's the kenke that was actually in the story. Some fishing boats that were also in the story. So you can kind of get a sense of the relationship between the imagined and the real, and how these students are drawing on their real life experiences. This is a fisher person, slave castle that was certainly not in the story. And then here we arrive at the mosque in the Cape Coast Zongo, and we hop off of our bus. And this is the area where we actually carried out these stories. So we ended up calling it Madrasa Alley. And it was essentially where the students would learn, they would go to Quranic school every Saturday and Sunday morning. And then after Quranic school was over, if they so chose, which most did, then they could participate in this storytelling workshop that I held every weekend for 3 years. And at first, I mean, it was just very, very open-ended, but then sometimes we would just sort of see where these stories would take us. Sometimes it would be about students telling their own stories, you know, that their grandparents had told them. Sometimes someone would have a particular kind of issue that they wanted to share or write about. Sometimes I would read stories from the United States and they would share stories from their own culture. But it was a combination of drawing. And then this is a picture that was taken a little bit later during one of my workshops, but a lot of reading too, for inspiration, but then also reading the culturally appropriate books. So books, you know, not like, I don't know, Mickey Mouse or the Three Little Pigs or something, but something that is culturally appropriate. And so that they are actually reading authors who are, you know, from West Africa, and the content of the story is something that they can identify with and that they've actually experienced in their lives. And then listening was and is a huge component of these workshops. So a lot of times, I mean, in addition, yes, they had to listen to me a little bit, but we always had guest speakers coming in. And so this is a woman who I was friends with in one of the Zongos who was telling stories. And so we had a whole class just dedicated to different storytellers coming in to talk about their own experiences. But we also had guests who some of them were journalists, some of them were cartoonists, some of them were, novelists, all kinds of artists came in so that the students could actually also see these people as models, as people that they could, you know, aspire to become someday too. And then we had all kinds of, we just called them story sheets or play sheets of ways to kind of think through this. So draw and write about a story you listened to in class, draw and write about a story you remember well. And they could choose to just draw, they could choose to just write, or they could choose some kind of combination. But it was also really important to think about, we thought about translation a lot. So how you take something that is spoken and then how you draw it, or how you draw something, or how you act something out, and then how you write about what you acted out. So that there's this constant sort of moving back and forth between different kinds of modes. And then, of course, you know, sharing was very important. So the students really enjoyed sharing their work with one another. And also, we did a lot of, you know, one-on-one sharing. So a lot of times students would either get stuck or just want to share something kind of more a personal story with one of us. And so we did that quite a bit. We also drew on performing. So this is actually, it's called a concert party in Ghana. And it's been very central to a lot of the ways that people in Ghana have thought about performance. And so we organized our own concert party, and we also actually acted out some of the stories that the students actually wrote and illustrated, and then shared some of and then the students also shared some of the concerns or the lessons that were embedded in these stories as well. Okay, so then now we get to the roundness or the kind of content. So what I just shared was more sort of process oriented. And of course, process and content are completely intertwined and interacting with one another all the time. But let's start with objects. So that was one way in which we started thinking about storytelling, was through material objects. So the students could actually touch and feel, look at, listen to a particular object and start telling a story with it. And so we, of course, were also trying to draw on objects that were local or close to their own experience. And in this case, we were actually looking at, there was wall art all around one of these Zongos. And so each student just took a particular piece of wall art and ended up writing a story about it. This student is writing a story about a piece of fabric that has a meaning, it has a name associated with it. Then there's, you know, drums and necklaces and purses and all kinds of, we always wanted them to be able to kind of touch and pick up and feel these objects. And it made it feel kind of more personal to them, more meaningful. And then this is a cartoonist who came in. So after the students were writing their stories about objects or writing about the object itself, then this cartoonist came in and actually talked about how, you know, these objects might be owned by particular superheroes, and then all the students designed their own superheroes. Again, this seemed a little bit imported, but it was a Ghanaian who was very excited to share about superheroes, so we went with it. Another way into storytelling and thinking about it through content was thinking about the problem. So there was one student actually in the Cape Coast Zongo where I worked, where I did the water project, who he was a very quiet student, but one day he raised his hand and just said how he was writing a really important story that it was not an imaginary one, and that it was true. And that it was about how his family essentially didn't have water for 3 months because the mining company upstream had been polluting the water. And even though this child was so timid, his words really struck a chord with the other students around him, and they all started chiming in saying the same thing. And so we ended up, that's actually that was kind of the kernel of the book Gizo Gizo, and how that came about was just a casual conversation about water that turned into something much more. So here's a real mining company in Ghana. This is actually happening. So here's Spider. I'm giving part of the plot away, but he starts up his own mining company. And then here we have just a couple more examples of different kinds of play sheets that we engage. So draw and write a story about a problem you faced in your life, prepare a skit about a problem. So we're always trying to kind of use our bodies, minds, hands engaged in everything that we were doing. And here are students plotting a performance that they're readying. They loved competitions, and so you can see they're kind of, yeah, deeply engaged in trying to win. And then we get to place, the third element of Story Soup. So students often enjoyed writing about the places they knew well, so their own homes, the shared spaces and what they would do in those spaces, activities that they were engaged in, and then, you know, larger environmental place or larger environments of which they were part, whether directly or indirectly. So this is their local lagoon that we ended up writing about in the story, and also thinking about it seasonally. So how the environments changed over time, and during the rainy season, or for example during the dry season. And then thinking, I mean, you all are zooming in and zooming out. I created that before Zoom was such a thing, but obviously as architecture students, this might seem very obvious, but to the students, they were kind of struck by this idea that, you know, something could seem really big and you know, include lots of details or be far away, and then that you could, you know, get up close and have a completely different sensibility or understanding of what the place or characters were about. And then also just thinking about place very holistically. So how you might feel in a place, what you hear, what you smell. So not just privileging the visual, which we so often do in Western society, but really taking kind of the full experience of the place to heart. And then here students were looking at pictures of places and then drawing them and writing about or coming up with a story about them. And then we get to character, which I think was by far the favorite of all of my students. So again, thinking about the fullness or the roundness of characters. So I think this idea of roundness, I think extends on many different levels. So here's, you know, about a single character, but then you can talk about one character actually meeting another. And so we ended up having performances, and, you know, each student was a different character and they would interact, and then they would create a story out of it. Here are some various characters that the students came up with. These were sort of the more final versions of the characters that we worked on in Gizo Gizo. We had many, many different versions of crab, tortoise, and spider, that's for sure. We looked at emotions. And then we also drew on for inspiration of the styles, for example, within the story itself, looking at local fabrics and the ways in which we could think through both their meaning and the kinds of textures and how that might sort of translate into the book, and colors as well. We made masks that sort of echoed some of the ideas of those fabrics, And then again, this is sort of a different version of our story, but again, they put on a performance. Okay, and then we get to action, which is essentially sort of putting it all together, right? Creating a temporality to the place, or multiple temporalities, which often we engaged performance or storytelling and performance. So we had, for example, an actor come in and tell us how to kind of act out, for instance, these emotions that the students were drawing, or the person that they were imagining to be the main character in their story. And so again, here's some sample play sheets. So tell a story using order. And then this one's just sort of more broad, but it gets, students sort of imagining something other. So, what if this happened, and then what would happen after that, and after that, and after that. Yes, and seeing the Pixar story outline. Yes, that's true. Yeah, it's true. And then here, this is another way of thinking about sequencing, but each student was drawing a different expression on the face of anyone that they chose, and then their task was to kind of link it together into a story. And then there is, of course, the serving of the story soup at the end. So we also did this in a number of ways, but we wanted to make sure that these stories were not something that was just kind of internal to our workshop, but that we shared with people, immediate community members, and then also various audiences like us here in the United States. So here is a student, I think, giving a prayer actually before she starts reading her story. Here are some listeners paying close attention, enjoying it. A student pointing out her own contribution in the story. We also did a gallery, so we actually displayed all of the drawings and the whole story, and actually all of the progress drawings as well, so that the students and community members could walk through and enjoy it. And then I also just want to point out, this is another piece that I think I've been kind of hinting at throughout the whole time, but just to be more explicit about it, which is, again, it's not about the product, right? It's about the process, and it's not about a single story. It's about creating multiple stories so that students can feel like they're both part of something bigger, but then also bringing their own sense of self and their own sensibilities and their own perspectives on the world for others to listen and hear. So Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie is another Nigerian novelist whom I really like. She's actually living in the United States right now, but she says, the single story creates stereotypes, and the problem with stereotypes is not that they aren't true, but they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. And then she writes a little more hopefully, when we realize that there is never a single story about any place, we regain a kind of paradise. So one of the goals of this project has been to kind of multiply the numbers and kinds of stories, and to elevate as much as possible the voices of people living in the Zongo, but not also just people living in the Zongo, really anyone's voice. Especially those who are less heard or often marginalized. And so we have a storytelling program playbook that includes all of the different worksheets we're working on, or play sheets we're trying to look at eventually getting that published. We're still sort of working and adding more pieces to it. And then we've so far just created one anthology called We Are All Ears, a collection of short stories that just has a number of the stories, are many of the stories that the students worked on in our 2019 workshop. And these have been disseminated all over multiple libraries in Ghana. I think almost every library in Ghana has them now. And so other students are reading these stories aloud to one another, and they're also using these play sheets. So what I would like to do is just end with, yes, more questions, not answers, because it seems like I tend to have more curiosities than I do, and sort of play with different ideas rather than come up with a strict answer. But I want to leave you with just a few questions. So as designers, what do we learn by listening to other people's stories? How does storytelling challenge us to think differently about our sense of place and the way we make marks upon the world? How might storytelling help us make room for more diverse voices in our projects? Might storytelling help us get to know places that feel deeply unfamiliar and revisit with renewed curiosity those places we thought we knew well? So that's all I have for today. Thank you all so much for listening, and I'm more than happy to take questions. I see a number of comments here in the chat. I was sort of missing, I think, a little bit when I was talking, but it's great.
Thank you, Emily. I know I have a series of questions, things that I would love to talk longer about. But if anyone has questions, feel free to drop them in the chat or unmute. I'll save my questions for a minute or two. Does anyone want to jump in?
I have a question. First off, great lecture. It was very informative. Very interesting to hear about the approach in which you went about the whole project. I thought the idea of storytelling really is appropriate for our 402 studio class right now, considering we're doing a promenade project. And it allowed me to think about things in a whole other, I guess, lens, basically, because we really do have to learn how to experience a space, experience that path and place. And so I think just overall amazing. But my question was, you had said that there was a point where for your path to figure out how to go about solving these issues, it wasn't linear, it was very irregular. And as it showed in the illustration, like a lot of pattern going on. What were some of your favorite parts or least favorite parts, or I guess even rocky moments to that path?
Oh, thank you so much. Do you pronounce your name Sheena?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay. Thank you so much, Sheena. That's a really wonderful question. Interestingly, I would say that the most challenging parts of that path in retrospect were the best, but in the moment they were the worst. So for instance, I will never forget the first meeting that I had so it was when I first decided to start the PhD program in anthropology. And I walked into the reception. There's a reception of all of us new students getting together with the professors. And I just kept getting the same question from all the professors, just saying, okay, well, what does place have to do with people? What do people have to do with place? And I just would, I was I really knew nothing about anthropology at that point. I really didn't know the theory. I was a straight up architecture student. It was just that my questions were changing and I just froze and I kept freezing and I didn't know how to answer it. And so, and I'm still, and now I think at least I realized that, well, that question is a little bit silly. And that how can you possibly go about answering that at a cocktail party, let alone in, 10 years of work. But I think that was definitely one of the rockiest moments. And still, I would say up until maybe the last couple years when maybe it's actually storytelling that's helped me, but because I'm starting to look at jobs and next steps, I've had to also kind of create my own story, right, of where I'm going and where I've come from. And so I think that's actually helped me a little bit, sort of feel like I have 2 feet on the ground and that I kind of know where I'm headed, even if it's going to change again. But I would say the rockiest points were those moments where I felt like I didn't fit into the architectural world, and I didn't fit into the anthropological world. And I still actually don't really fit into either. I fit into both in weird ways, but it's something I continuously have to navigate and something I continuously have to sort of prove to other people that I can do both. Or that I can do one or the other. And that I find very, very challenging and frustrating. But yeah, it's a definitely continued challenge. Lots of speed bumps.
Good question, Sheena.
Yeah.
Maybe related to kind of the storytelling of a career and telling your own story and being in control of how that story unfolds. In the chat, we have a question from Navia. I don't know if that's how you pronounce it. Sorry if that's wrong. they said, great lecture. What's the best way to get involved in work like this? It's hard to find opportunities like this. And maybe, Navia, in the chat, you could maybe elaborate on what like this is. I think, and I'll just maybe fill in the blank. I think one way to understand that question might be find opportunities or get involved in work that you self-generate, that's entrepreneurial and kind of self-directed and kind of answering questions that you have rather than plugging into a bigger project. And then the flip side would be, how do you find people doing work that you care about and that you're passionate about, and plug into someone else's work? So I don't know exactly what the like this is, but maybe talking, Emily, from your experience about plugging into work that's happening that you care about, and then building momentum around a really important idea that you're driving yourself. So maybe two ends of that spectrum.
Okay. Yeah, so those are great questions. And again, I would say that this is sort of part of my rocky road, let's say, in that it's not easy. It's really, really, really hard. And when I graduated from UVA, I was so frustrated because I had so much good energy and was so excited to do community-based design work. And I wanted to continue with, passionately with what I was doing in West Africa, wanted to find ways to stay there. And it was really, really, really hard. I applied for positions at, the World Bank, which was never going to actually be a good fit in retrospect. I couldn't really find a nonprofit that was a good fit. I ended up working at an architecture firm in DC that was I think was doing that as much as they could, but it is very, very difficult to find ways to make money and to do what I do. Hence maybe why I look out at dumpsters. but that being said, you can find people. It takes time. It takes a lot of energy. It takes for me, I think what helped the most was finding excuses after excuses to go back to Ghana. And every time I went back to Ghana, I would meet a new nonprofit. So I ended up meeting more people there and kind of creating my networks through library owners, people who ran nonprofit organizations, preservation specialists, tourism specialists, like all of these kind of not this sort of nonprofit world over there. And a lot of people some of them were coming from Europe, some of them were coming from the United States. But I think for me, the way that I ended up getting more traction was by actually being in the place where I wanted to work and going from there, and not necessarily starting with a particular discipline. So starting actually with the place itself and with, the people that I was working with in that place, and sort of, and working out from there. But that was, yeah, it's certainly not easy. And then, sorry, the second question was how I've worked on my own, kind of developing my own ideas.
Yeah, I mean, or however you interpret that question. I was just brainstorming what, what the question was about. Yeah. So, so that piece, again, I think it took doing. It's not something, kind of like drawing. You don't necessarily know how your drawing is going to come out in the end, until you're actually doing it. And I think us as designers and architects and urban planners probably know that better than anyone else, right? Like you start doing something and all of a sudden you're kind of surprised, or you discover something through the act of doing it. And so I don't think ahead of time I was planning anything of how my life ended up. But it was much more of a kind of an unfolding process of, oh, this is really a curiosity of mine. This I want to know more about. This I really care about. And then getting there, doing that, and then seeing what the next set of questions were. So rather than sticking to
the easy thing that you can do, which is, oh, I just want to be an anthropologist, or I just want to be an architect. I tried to do this in my presentation a little bit, but focus on the questions and the curiosities that drove my interest, and then figure out how to kind of harness the energy around those questions, and what kinds of disciplines or what kinds of modes of, drawing, writing, reading, listening you need to sort of put your energy and ideas into answering it.
Great. Peter, I saw your real hand up.
Yeah, I wanted to thank you for the talk and the work. It's really inspiring. And I love the part that I liked the most, I think, was the mask that the kids made, in the book. And I'm wondering if there were ideas about trying to take this idea of narrative and place and tie it together through even having them make more things than the story. I just put a link in here, and I'm sure you're familiar with Mockbee's work, but before he did the rural studio, he and this is covered in the film Citizen Architect, he would engage with the community and, with this idea of narrative, but then they would actually make like a drawing that they could inhabit. You can see in those images in the links. And I just think that the work you're doing is really cool, and that's something that you might be interested in.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. That's really interesting. And again, I think speaks to how I think about translation too, and sort of moving from, performance to then writing about that performance. And then I could imagine, another layer of that is thinking about, okay, what do we construct from this? Physically construct this, and sort of working at different scales. The thing that's worked really well with storytelling so far is that it's not expensive. You don't have to think about that added question of how to get the money to pay for materials, and then where is that thing going to live, and the politics of that. And there's something about the lightness and transportability of stories that has made it easier to implement there than actually kind of inhabited structures. And also, these people can't even find rice often to eat. So it's very hard to imagine them caring about wanting to temporarily inhabit a structure than feeding their families. So there are just kind of realities like that it becomes very, very, very tricky. But if you could find a way to make it feel incredibly useful and, somehow kind of opportunistic for this group of people, then I think something like that could be possible. It would just need to be something that people cared enough about to really want to build, which is especially challenging in communities like Zongo's, where people are constantly on the move and everyone's dream is to leave.
Wow, fascinating.
Yeah.
Thinking about place, time, what, priorities, what makes something worth building and being material.
Yeah.
Very, to go back to maybe the line of questioning, what do place and people have to do with each other? I think Julie put in the chat everything. What other questions do people have? I'll throw in a kind of I don't know, nerdy one, disciplinary one. And Peter put in the chat at one point about the sectional drawing of the lagoon, which I noticed the same thing. And I've been thinking through your talk about how, from the outside, drawing is kind of monolithic, but once you're inside, there's so many types, plan, section, perspective, elevation. And in the illustrations from the book, you can see all different versions of that, and sometimes hybrid drawings where the plan and the elevation are in the same drawing. Or is that something that you think about actively as you work with the students or as you construct the book, or is that kind of unsaid and you do naturally? Do they understand those tools, Or do you think about those tools in language and storytelling and writing? I don't know.
Yeah,
More of a
that's
prompt than a question.
That's a great question. So in the larger storytelling workshops I've done, it's been too challenging to teach about sections, about plans, about sectional perspectives. But in the kind of more intensive, longer program that I did with the students, where we did design Gizo, we did address that kind of thing. And it was actually very intentional, and in part because, my background is in architecture, but also I think there's something to, again, sort of bringing in, instead of different voices, or in addition to different voices, different perspectives, right? So that you can be looking at the same thing through another lens. So again, it's sort of through drawing, this way of opening up kind of multiple possibilities or seeing things in different ways. And so I found it valuable. It's also just makes a story, aesthetically more appealing, right? If you're not just looking at the same thing at the same scale from the same direction all the time, which a lot of children's stories do. But so it was intentional. It's not something that some of them, and the students ranged from 6 years old all the way up till 18. And a huge also range of skills within that. And so it was almost impossible one-on-one sometimes with the students who are really advanced, or who could, some students could draw really, really well, but they couldn't write very well, and vice versa. So it was a challenge, to say the least. But there were some students, when we would do kind of individual walkarounds, kind of like a studio, that I could certainly work with students who were more advanced to talk to them about that. Yeah.
Great. Fascinating. Other questions? Go for it.
If there isn't another one immediately, I was wondering, Emily, how would you feel about showing a couple of those graphic notes that you made of readings and just talking about the process of making those?
Sorry, the making of the
graphic notes you did of the sort of cartoons of the books that you read.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Okay.
The ones that I showed in my presentation today.
Oh no, I was thinking of the notes that are on your website of the books you were reading for your dissertation.
Oh yeah. I'm not sure how to. It would probably be difficult to talk about it without having an image.
Yeah. All right.
But let's see. Maybe I can find an image really quick.
I don't mean to divert, but also if it's better, if the better question would be kind of how you arrived at the sort of style of the illustrations in the book. As I know you were talking about moving from what the students were drawing and kind of how you chose the color palettes and just the sort of personalities of the characters.
Yeah, so it's interesting. The students, I don't know what it is, but they draw much more abstractly than I think a lot of the students in the United States. I mean, so I've done some storytelling workshops in the United States too. And I find that, I don't know why, but students in Ghana tend to, they will draw a circle, and then they will draw a triangle, they will draw a square, and they will make it into a person. And then they will also stylistically use patterns much more than students in the United States. And again, I think maybe it's just the fabric that is just everywhere that they see on a daily basis. And so they just sort of, soak that up, and then it becomes part of their repertoire of drawing. But so, I mean, in part, it was how these students were drawing. It was almost like they were already architects. So a lot of that kind of came naturally. But then we did also do a lot of walking around, and we would go look at these fabrics, and we would walk up and see what other people were wearing, and the different kind, how things were fabricated in wood shops, and sometimes in ironworking. And so the students did have the chance to kind of see firsthand what the artifacts that were being produced were like. And then also a lot of artists came in and showed their work. And so actually one of the artists is behind me right there. So I think that they were also inspired by kind of a lot of local work that just happens to be kind of much more abstract and stylistic, if that makes any sense. And then of course I incorporated my own ideas about, we didn't have a lot of color. And so a lot of the color, I worked on that and sort of drew on the fabrics, the local fabrics, and just kind of tried to figure out what kind of complemented one another. Does that answer your question? Or
Yeah, that's
Okay.
great.
And I'm happy to pull up those. I'm trying to see if I have those drawings.
I found them on your website. I could share my screen if that.
Oh, okay, sure.
I really want this to happen.
Okay, yeah. So those are some of the drawings. Yeah, so these I was working on my qualifying exams, and I guess it's, again, it's the architect in me. And so one other thing that has been interesting for me in the process of moving from architecture to anthropology and back again is that how much design is just kind of also instilled in you, even if your subject matter is not a building or a landscape, that you think spatially about things, and that it's a whole other set of tools and of language that you can use on an everyday basis, and that enriches the way I think you can understand theory, the way you can read into different texts. And for me, the way that I absorb information almost always is through drawing and understanding what kinds of relationship things have with one another, the different kinds of hierarchies, densities, placements. And so I was working on my qualifying exams, and I think I had over 300 books to read, and I created just a little index card for every single one of those books, and sometimes multiple. And it was for me, it was a very helpful process to just, especially with the theory, because somehow theory lends itself to sort of spatial analysis more clearly than, for instance, ethnographies, which are, far more descriptive. So, for instance, Hannah Arendt, The Origins of Totalitarianism. I mean, it was very easy to kind of get a sense of and really sort of feel actually like the hierarchy building up there, and the place of terror and ideology relative to sympathizers down below. And then, for instance, this is a simple one, but Yi Fu Tuan, Space and Place, and just the simple ways in which people orient themselves, or at least he proposed people orient themselves towards the sacred and profane. And I mean, so I did just tons and tons of these drawings, and I think my committee thought I was a little crazy. And they might still think I am, but it did really, really help me. But I think next time I would want to take this further. If I think if my committee if any of them had been architects or had been spatial thinkers, maybe they would have encouraged me to do this. But also if I had more time, I think taking very similar ideas, like for instance, all theories about boundary making or something like that, or all theories about mobility, and just sort of really narrowing it down, and then doing drawings and then comparing them to one another, and using that same kind of spatial language to get a sense of how different ideas sort of stack up, or how you can compare them to one another. And so you can sort of get a visual conversation going between, or sort of across the different scholars. And I'm actually thinking about I might try to do that for my dissertation. I'm currently doing a lot of literature review on uncertainty. And so trying to spatialize uncertainty, as impossible as that sounds.
It sounds like that could be a great seminar too, to kind of get multiple to the whole process about using like collective drawing and storytelling and comparative analysis.
Yeah.
Thank you. How big are these drawings? I'm just like so fascinated with them. You can tell.
Oh, they're tiny. They're just on, what is it, 4x6s or something
Oh, wow.
I just used the index cards,
That's
or
wonderful.
maybe a little bit bigger than, no, they were on those tiny, the smallest sketch pads.
Yeah, I think those are.
But around 4x6, something like that.
That's
Yeah,
great.
they were small because I thought about doing something bigger, but I just, don't want it to be intimidating. And the last thing I needed was to kind of create more work for myself. And I was reading so many books. And so just doing something very small was just somehow, and it really pushes you to be concise and to take, the biggest idea of whatever, the central argument, and to draw it.
It's a great idea. And like, I can imagine doing that for a lot of different things, like a building or, I think that strategy applies so broadly. Good question, Julie. Thanks for bringing that.
Yeah, I mean, I can actually imagine you doing that with your studio projects. Maybe students, diagram one another's project and diagrams the argument or the question or whatever it is.
Definitely. Julie, do you have anything else? Okay. Well, we are running up against the bookend of our lecture. Thank you so much, Emily, for sharing your process, your products, your perspective, and hopefully we can continue to engage you and have you back for maybe one day in-person events and things on campus when there's less uncertainty in the world. So thank you. And again, a very quiet exit, but otherwise it would be filled with applause. And I'll stick around if anyone has any, feedback for me or any questions, thoughts. Otherwise, thank you guys for attending and we'll see you soon.
Thank you all so much.
It's as if we wrote our last assignment for studio knowing that you would give this lecture.
I know,
It's
right?
Unbelievable.
I couldn't believe how many points you covered. Like, I mean, some of it was purely coincidental. That's what I'm saying. It was awesome.
Wow. Thank you. This is fantastic.
Yeah, very cool.
Thank you all so much for having me.
Thank you. We hope to meet you in person soon, Emily.
Yes, that would be nice.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.
Kind of crazy that maybe because like you're in home court advantage in an architecture school, but it all seems such a it you don't seem out of place. It seems like these skills are so applicable all over, but maybe when you're the newcomer to a discipline that they don't understand the translation between the skills and the discipline. But I guess you have a sympathetic audience here.
Oh, well, that's nice. Yeah, it's been interesting. I think it would be really, and I should actually do this. I should give the same talk to a bunch of anthropologists and see what they say.
Yeah.
I haven't done that because I created this talk just for you, but what if I gave exactly the same talk and see what happens? I don't know. Probably wouldn't go over very well. You really have to do it for you. You have to know your audience. And I don't think anthropologists would. I don't know. I think they would be waiting for the theory part of it. I don't think they would be interested in the. I think they think the images are interesting, but not necessarily worth thinking about so much. They just don't know how. They don't have the tools to know how to think about them.
Mm-hmm. Because they have their own sort of vocabulary and form. They have their own relationship between form and content, right? The way that they process and present theories and research materials is part of a long tradition, it sounds like.
Mm-hmm. And there's also a long tradition in anthropology of moving away from, or in the past, I would say more recently, people are introducing imagery again, but for a long time, it was just not okay because anthropology had really, its foundations, were really colonialism, and people were recording what these various tribes looked like and kind of categorizing them in different ways and photographing them. And it was extremely problematic. And so then anthropology went kind of extremely to the other direction, right? And just said, no images, nothing. But images can also be used to bring places to life and bring people to life and bring multiple stories into discussion that make it more difficult, if you don't have images. And it's just easier I find it's just so much easier to understand what people are talking about.
Yes.
You will go to a lot of anthropology presentations and there are no images, no drawings, no photographs, nothing. And it's supposed to be about understanding, these places in depth. It's like,
about material culture.
Yeah.
I know, not
it's
folklore.
like it's literally like place does not exist, which is so bizarre.
Because that's what they're
literally
studying.
just like people in. Some people. I think more and more people are thinking more specifically about place, but strangely enough. Even though anthropology is all about, going to, the unfamiliar or, making the unfamiliar familiar, the actual kind of physical or material sensualness of place has only recently kind of come into their purview. I would say since like maybe the late 1990s.
Wow, that's fascinating.
And we take it for granted. We have whole components of our curriculum that are visual studies and visual representation and visual communication. To
the point where architecture students,
it's
sort of a cliche, but they don't like to read. They do read, but I just think, it's like, what, we have to do that too?
I just remember as a student that there was so much emphasis on studio that it was so difficult that if I was going to read, I wanted it to be something that was applicable to my studio project. If it wasn't, then I was going to speed through it, even if it was fascinating. So it's tough. I think some schools take reading more or less seriously than others, and I don't know. Depends. At UVA, we definitely. Studio was it. That was the center of everything.
Was Drips teaching speculations when you were there? Did you take that?
No.
Oh, that was great.
That sounds good though.
It was a seminar and all we did was read. We worked our way through all the theory, starting with like Vitruvius and Viollet-le-Duc, and we read a lot of books. Like, it was ridiculous.
Yeah. So I actually did take a theory class with her, but it wasn't called Speculations.
Oh, okay. Maybe
it was essentially the same thing.
And rebranded.
And there was a lot of reading and I did it all.
Yeah. Oh gosh. Yeah. Yeah.
And actually, now that I'm thinking about it, she did have us do some drawings for that class to draw the theory, or maybe I just chose to draw it. I don't know. I think maybe I just chose to draw it. Clearly I needed it to understand what the heck was going on.
Yeah. That's why.
Well, thanks, Emily.
Well, thank you both so much. It was a pleasure. I wish, we could have met in person, and hopefully someday we still will, but
we have, all of us have so many semesters ahead of us, opportunities.
Hopefully.
We'll do.
I'm just thinking about getting through this weekend.
That too.
That too. We'll have a way to connect. There's tons of things that I think we would love to have you down for. So thanks again, and talk to you